okay without the microphone? Okay, I've never been told I needed a microphone, so good to know. So I just want to start by introducing myself. I'm Bridget. I am a certified athletic trainer, a orthotic fitter, that's what the CFO is. So I work a lot with orthotics and bracing and orthoses for that. And then I'm also a personal trainer, and I'm a third-year PhD student at the U studying sport and exercise psychology. So a lot of work with blending athletic medicine with the sports psychology side of things, because it's newer to talk about, but it's not a new topic, that things are very much, there's a mental aspect to it. So moving forward, today's agenda, I'm going to first define what I'm talking about with mental skills. There's actually not one universal definition for mental skills, so I'll give you what I'm talking about today. And then we'll kind of break it into 3 mini talks, ending with some application and practice. So, as you could tell from the title, the quote's from Yogi Berra saying baseball is 90% mental, the other half is physical. I love that quote because, first of all, the math doesn't add up, and that just makes me smile every time I hear it. But also, if you just take baseball out and put whatever your event is in there, or your sport, or even something you're doing in life, I think it applies. I apologize if those aren't, I'm from Iowa, so I know there's a little bit of difference from like high school track and everything, so sorry if I make a example that's not something you all have, or it's different somehow. I should just preface that. So, let's define mental skills. Really, these are the strategies that we use that spark, maintain, or enhance optimal performance. You could also add in they help spark optimal recovery as well. I know the session before me was on some recovery strategies, the importance of sleep and everything. So it's, as much as it's helping you with performance, it's helping that athlete recover as well. So some of the ones that are commonly talked about are imagery, goal setting, relaxation strategies, and then positive self-talk. So what we mean by imagery is this is a multi-sensory experience. A lot of people will be like, well, I do visualization, which is great, but that's only one aspect of imagery. Imagery is bringing in all of the senses. It's, can you feel the sweat on your body? Can you hear your mom yelling at you from the stands to run faster? Can you see your teammate in front of you when you're handing that baton off to them? So it's very multi-sensory. And what is important here is, just like with the physical skills, the more they practice this, the better they become at it. And this is true for any mental skill. When we talk about getting better at imagery, a lot of times if you have somebody and they're a beginner at it, you want to start with something very simple. So thinking about can you see you're holding an apple? Can you see yourself holding the apple? And then you progressively add in more steps. I will give you a note here. Some athletes, they're better at different senses. So just working with the athlete, some of them can smell something very well. They have a better sense of taste. So just working with them to first start with a sense that they can just right off the bat do. It doesn't always have to start with seeing something. It could be, okay, I want you to picture a lemon, and maybe instantly they can taste the lemon in their mouth. So go with that. And then add the steps in. Self-talk this is a very technical definition of it, but really it's what we say to ourselves. Whether we know we're saying it to ourselves or not, that is self-talk. A lot of times, I know I've reflected back, I've had athletes reflect back, they're having a bad day, they're in rehab, they're angry, and I'm like, hey, that really wasn't the greatest squat that you did. What did you just say to yourself? And they're like, well, that I suck. And they didn't realize that they were telling themselves, I can't do this, my knee hurts, Bridget's been yelling at me all day because my squat form's terrible, so it must be terrible, so that's what I've been telling myself. And then they're like, oh wait, I was completely just putting myself down that whole time. Versus they had a really great rep, and it's like, well, what did you say? Oh, well, what you've been cueing me with all rehab session. So a lot of times they may not know that they're saying something to themselves. Goal setting. I really hope I don't have to define goal setting to you all. I don't think I've met an athlete, especially at the high school level, who is like, I have no idea what goal setting is. But I will say, if you do have to explain it, just make sure they know that it's a collaboration. You're not telling them what they're going to achieve. You're working with them to help them discover what they want to obtain, and then you're creating that roadmap to obtain it. So the biggest thing a lot of people think, and especially when you're working with big teams, you tell them what the goal is. Research actually shows that doesn't help them reach the goal. If they're not somehow involved in the process of choosing what that goal is, you might as well have just not set a goal. There are a lot of different frameworks to use here. I use SMART, but as you can see, as research has gone on, people have added letters. Really just make sure it's specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and you put a timeline on it. So it's not like, I'm going to do this, and you never say you're going to do what, when. And that's important because short-term goals really help us achieve those long-term goals. It's also important to set short-term goals because a lot of times long-term goals are outside of our control. So when they say, I want to place, third in every competition I run, well, that can be kind of difficult because what if you're running up against the top runners? That's not really within your control. But if you say, I want to have a flawless handoff every time I run a relay, that's within your control. That's something you can control. So making sure that they have things that they can succeed at so they don't get discouraged as you're setting other goals. And then finally, relaxation. So there's a lot of different techniques we use for relaxation. But the biggest thing to know is there's physical forms of relaxation and mental forms of relaxation. So we'll be talking more so on the mental side of relaxation, but a lot of times there's some overlap, especially thinking like biofeedback training. You're doing a lot of heart rate, progressive muscle relaxation. You're actually physically tensing and relaxing a muscle. But thinking of things more cognitively, like meditation, really focusing internally, like syncing with that breath and just really taking a moment to yourself and listening to what your inner self is saying, not what's going on in the outer world. And I will say that a major popular trend right now, especially in research, is mindfulness. So stay tuned on that. I'm sure it will make its way into coaching curriculum if it hasn't already. I just did a research or a literature review on it, and everything in the past 3 years, it's like mindfulness, mindfulness, mindfulness. I'm like, okay, mindfulness is important, which it is. But there'll be more to it. There's not a lot known on it right now, specifically in sport. So hopefully that will get to you all soon. So questions on the definition of mental skills before I go into injury prevention. And if you have questions throughout, feel free to just throw your hand up. I teach college students, and they're just used to yelling out their questions at me, so don't feel that you have to wait till the end to ask a question. All right, so just a little bit of background here. So sport injury risk is really biopsychosocial in nature. We focus a lot on the physical side of injury, which that's great, it happens. We know people get hurt because of physical factors. But there's also a lot of research and a lot of you talk to any coach, you talk to any athlete, there's a lot of other things going on in that athlete's life that probably predispose them to getting that injury. So I want to ask you all, before I share what the research says on this, do we think that higher levels of major and minor life stress, so those daily hassles, even those big events, does that increase or decrease their risk of injury?
Increase.
What about higher levels of anxiety?
Increase.
What about negative mood states?
Increase.
What if your athlete has lower levels of coping resources? So they can't cope with things, they don't know how to. Excellent. 4 for 4. Well done. All right, so keeping that in the back of your mind, the International Olympic Committee actually has come out with a new statement on what an athlete's load is. So a lot of times we're working as coaches and sport medicine professionals to really balance the athlete's load. We want to make sure they're doing all of these things. Well, okay, what is an athlete's load? The IOC just flat out said it's both the sport and non-sport burden. So it's not only what they're doing physically when they're on the track, it's what's happening to them as just people as well. And like we talked about, this is problemsome because a majority of those injury prevention programs are on the physical factors. So it's saying, a lot of things, especially for female athletes, like ACL rehab and knee prehab and everything, is huge. But it's that's great, and yes, ACL injuries happen, especially in female athletes, but what about all of those psychosocial factors that are influencing them? And they're like, oh, I don't know. Like, they'll figure it out. Just tell them to breathe. So, speaking further into what the IOC is telling us, we see that injury happen, or burnout, or fatigue, overtraining. That athlete comes up to you and they're like, I am just exhausted. That happens when you're really not focusing on both the physical and the health and well-being. You have to focus on both of them together to really protect that athlete and prevent those injuries. So the way that we do this, creating more holistic injury prevention programs, is we add mental skills. And you won't be shocked, but those are the mental skills that research is saying is most beneficial for injury prevention. The 3 added at the bottom, we talked about mindfulness, but the stress management program and the multimodal programs are really just blending a lot of those techniques that we talked about. So blending a lot of relaxation training and autogenic training in for stress management, and then multimodal programs, not uncommon to do all 4 of them over the course of maybe a season. And the use of these skills is really based in theory, and I want to share that all with you because this is something really great when you're talking to parents, to explain to them, like, this is why I'm telling you to use mental skills. It's not just you're up there saying, like, I'm the coach and I'm saying this is happening. It's nice, I think, to know the reasoning behind that. I always do that when I speak to a coach about an injury. I give all of the history to them of what's happening, so we're both really well informed. So, like we talked about, an athlete's personality. So we talked about how anxiety increases their risk of injury. So that would fall under the personality bucket. Worry is another one that we see a lot with athletes. They're just really worried, whether that's about sport or something that's happening in their everyday life. If they have finals coming up, we know that's a big time period in athletes' lives that they're actually at higher risk for injury. And there's research to back that during finals and high academic stress can put them at higher risk of injury. And that kind of leads us to history of stressors. So not only those major life events, but also those daily hassles. I know when I worked with high school, like homecoming was always like, the athletic training room was just buzzing with like, oh, so-and-so didn't ask me, or they asked me, and then where are you going to eat, and how are we getting there, and all this stuff. And it's like, great, but you should really focus on the fact that you're about to step onto a court or a field or a track and like be focused in on that, but that wasn't happening. They were not focused on what was going on. It's important to note in this bucket too is where injury falls in, so their history of injury, if they've had a lot of injury, if they've had bad experiences with injury rehab, this is something that can also put them at greater risk of injury. And then we talked about coping resources. If they're a great coper, they like have been dealing with stress their whole life and they're very resilient, excellent. But I know a lot of student athletes who have no coping skills or very poor coping skills, and they don't realize that until they get hurt, and they're like, I have no idea what to do. Like, this has never happened before. So just realizing sometimes they think they're great copers until something happens. So just really, getting ahead of that and teaching them how to cope before it happens is great. So these all influence an athlete when they're in a stressful situation. And the key here is that the athlete has to deem it stressful. You can't say like, hey, this is a really, really important meet. Like, don't screw it up. If they don't think that it's important, they probably are just gonna do their thing and whatever, not really be prone to injury. But if they deem this as something that's incredibly stressful, this is when we start seeing that risk of injury start to rise. So it's how they're responding. So let's say you have an athlete who they're late to practice because they had to stay after school, they had a pop quiz which they bombed, they can't figure out their homecoming plans, and they missed part of the warm-up, so they're really not doing anything here. Then you're telling them like, hey, if you don't like hit this time trial, like you're not running in the meet and everything, and they're like, oh my gosh, here we go. We can see how all of that kind of adds onto that athlete and puts them a little bit more at a risk of injury than somebody who's like, was there for an hour ahead of time, they're warmed up, like they're more warmed up than anybody else, and they're like, yeah, this is great, like I have my homecoming plans figured out, like I aced that pop quiz, bring it on, kind of thing. They're seeing that more as a challenge that they can take on, so we can see where that difference in their risk of injury would fall. And something that's been added on to the bottom of here is really with that research on mental skills. They're saying to help athletes when they're in these stressful situations and they just can't cope, they don't know what to do, they're really, really, really stressed out, we use mental skills to help them. And that's what research is showing, that it's directly influencing how they're responding to stress. So you may be asking, what research do I keep talking about? So this is based off of 18 intervention studies, and the interventions were using those mental skills. So it was programs across various sports, different types of programs, but all using those mental skills. And what they found is that when those athletes use those mental skills interventions, their injury rate, as well as the time they spent away from injury, decreased. Their sport anxiety, we talked about worry, how worried they were about anything related to sport, also decreased. And then perceived stress, how they were perceiving it. Whether or not their actual stress levels decreased, you can't say because stress is subjective, but using the perceived stress scale, like asking them, like, do you feel stressed? That decreased. And then their coping increased, which is great because these are all things that help them protect themselves against injury. And based off of this research, there were some limitations to it. Obviously, not all research and practice is perfect, but they know it's working. The question is why. So that's really where coaches come in to play, is asking your athletes, okay, why is this working for you? What are you doing? Like, if you have an athlete who's just succeeding left and right, ask them what they're doing. And then you can have them talk with maybe their teammates. We know that peer-to-peer interaction of like, hey, they're doing it, I want to do what they're doing to be better, really helps. So we don't need research to tell us why. We need people out there in the field asking why, and the athletes stepping forward and saying, this is what's working for me, you should try this, or have you thought about this? Really that peer support. And then just a few research points here. They did use different assessment tools, so there's like a million different questionnaires. If you're interested in knowing which ones they used because you would like to use them, I can share those with you, but there are a lot out there. There's some really great ones that give you numbers like right away, especially if you have an athlete who's maybe a little bit skeptical to this. If you wanted to use those scales, I can share those with you. And I think it's also important as consumers of research and theory, because we want to take this forward to our athletes, to our parents, that it's important to know there's not a universally accepted definition of injury. So when you're reading research or even in textbooks or curriculum that you might be doing for continuing education, it's important to know what they're deeming as an injury. So a lot of this research, they said it wasn't an injury unless they missed 4 days of practice. As an athletic trainer, that's worrisome because as soon as they are having an injury, or like they're having like an episode of pain, that to me is an injury, where they're coming up to you and saying like, hey, my foot hurts. Okay, well, I don't care that if it takes you out for 4 days. We also know, I'm sure nobody is shocked by knowing athletes play through injury and everything, so by not calling it an injury until 4 days later, problematic. So just being aware that when they're saying injury, it might not be what we're all thinking. And then there also were various injury reporting protocols, so this is kind of my call to you as coaches. We love when coaches report the injuries. It gets a little sketchy when you ask the athletes to self-report. I just know that from personal experience of doing a lot of like physical intake exams. Some athletes come in and it's like every toe that they've stubbed has been added onto the injury list. And I'm like, this is really great, but how did that toe feel? Oh, it was fine like 30 seconds later. And I'm like, great, not really something I needed to know. So we love when coaches get involved and actually say like, nope, this is what's happening. So please, like, if somebody comes to you and says like, will you help me record injuries? Please say yes. That's why. But there are a lot of strengths to these intervention studies. They support that model, which we already knew. That's how the model was created. They emphasize the importance of taking this holistic approach to injury prevention. And a lot of times, they don't reach statistical significance, which I could really care less because they have clinical meaningfulness. And on the next slide, I will explain why I like clinical meaningfulness as a clinician. So, one of the studies, it was by Iverson et al. They said it didn't reach statistical significance. However, they were using sample sizes that were the same as roster sizes. And me as an athletic trainer, I'm like, great, you're telling me something that's real. Like, you're not saying like, here's 500 athletes and this was statistically significant. Here was 40 athletes and 20 were in the intervention group, which was mindfulness, and 20 were in the control group, and the intervention group had almost 50% less injury than the control group with no intervention. And I think we can all agree that one less injury is a win. So now you're telling me we had 50% less injury. I don't care that that wasn't statistically significant in your study, because that's clinically meaningful to me. So just being really great consumers of that, always kind of like read through to the end, and they'll talk about this a lot in the limitations, but just knowing there's great research out there that they'll say didn't find any results. So to bring it full circle, if we're just looking at the research, the answer to if mental skills help with injury prevention is like a potentially, it could happen kind of thing. They just get really stuck on that statistical significance here. But when we take the research and the practical implications, if you just talk to the athlete, if you talk to the coaches who are using these, if you talk to just anybody who's been around somebody who's very big with mental skills, especially with prevention, they're definitely beneficial. I can tell you that from firsthand experience, and just from a lot of athletes, a lot of the students that I teach are student athletes, and they're like, oh yeah, we do this all the time. Like, we're big imagery people. So it's happening without us knowing it too, so that's great. Questions on injury prevention? All right. So now we're going to talk about injury rehabilitation and return to life. I can say this is kind of where I excel as an athletic trainer. I actually medically retired from an ankle injury, and I can tell you that there is nothing more true than an injury is at minimum 90% mental. We know very well what to do physically to get an athlete back, but not a lot of people ask them like how you're feeling and really taking in that mental side of the injury. So to start, I want to talk about why I use the word return to life. So a lot of my clinical work has been with high school, collegiate, and then also tactical athletes, so I've worked with the military. And this is a more holistic term to match what I've had athletes tell me. So they're more than just their sport, they're more than what they do on the court, the field, the track. They are a person outside of that, and as athletic trainers and coaches, I think it's important we remember that an athlete is just one part of who they are, so I like to say return to life. Also, in the collegiate setting and high school setting, absolutely they're a student before they're an athlete. We don't call them athlete students. We want them to first and foremost excel in the classroom, so sometimes that means that maybe they're out a little bit longer for an injury because they have the rest of their life to be thinking about here. Especially thinking, I've done a lot of research with concussions, so that is where a lot of that happens, is the cognitive side. And then returning goals. I've worked with a lot of athletes who they're like, you know what, I'm kind of okay not returning to sport. Like, I was out because all of my friends were on the team, and you know what, that's fine, but I do want to be like physically active just outside of things, so their goal isn't necessarily to return to play. Also thinking too, sometimes injuries you don't get to return from. You may get back to a certain level, but not the level that you need to be at to compete. So when you're talking about, hey, what do you want to get out of this? Making sure it's realistic, and sometimes that's not sport. And it's unfortunate to have that conversation with that athlete, but I guarantee you if you help them figure out what else is there, what's next. I've worked with a lot of athletes who have had to medically retire, and the biggest thing I can say is helping them realize that what their life will be like, and it will be okay without just that sport. So I guess I want to ask you, what mental skills do you think we use in rehab and return to life?
Visualization.
Yeah. If you're thinking, spoiler, it's the exact same ones that we use in injury prevention and performance, which is really interesting because they're highly, highly, highly underutilized, but have amazing benefits. So it brings us that holistic approach to rehab, but it also helps speed up recovery, it helps with pain, it helps with range of motion, it helps with confidence, self-efficacy. The benefits of using mental skills in rehab are just, the research is insane for what it is. It also helps them develop control in rehab. So a lot of times when you have an athlete who's injured, they feel like their life is kind of going to shambles. They don't know what to do. You've just taken away the one thing that they might be very good at and that they look forward to every day. And now it's like, okay, well, sorry, you're kind of on crutches. You're not really going anywhere, type of thing. So it helps give them that control back. It helps them be motivated to show up and adhere, which is important because if they're not showing up, they're probably not going to rehab very well. Like it's documented in research, but I think all of us know if we don't put in the work, you're not going to see the benefits. And then also, not super specific to coaches directly, but it improves the communication between the athlete and the sport medicine provider, which I can tell you from working with a lot of coaches is key because sometimes they don't want to be that middle person between the athlete and the sport medicine provider. They want to support the athlete, but they don't want to be like, okay, well, so-and-so told me this. Yep, okay, we'll tell them this. It's kind of that back and forth. So if you encourage them to use mental skills, that can be really great because it kind of takes you out of the middle, but it also helps them learn communication skills too. So, like I mentioned, they're underutilized. Nobody actually has the exact reason why they're underutilized, but they really like to have some ideas about, some hypotheses about this. So they're used a lot in performance. Athletes all the time will talk about yep, I set goals, I do imagery, I talk to myself when I play, things like that, and then they get hurt and it just stops. And nobody knows why it's not making that transition from performance, something that they're doing almost every day, to now they're in injury and they're not doing it at all. We don't know why. If you'd like to figure that out, please let me know what you discover. It's also, we're not sure we are 100% certain how to physically rehab something, but there is no mental skills protocol. So when an athlete gets injured, as an athletic trainer, I have a whole encyclopedia of injury rehabs. Like an ACL, I have a stack that's this big of what I'm doing week by week with that athlete physically. For 9 months, I can tell you exactly what they're doing in week 12. That doesn't exist for mental skills. There's nothing alongside of it that says hey, you should be doing some healing imagery so they can really feel that graft attaching to the bone and their knee getting strong. That doesn't exist anywhere. That's on the clinicians and the coaches to be able to bring that into rehab. And then education and training. There's been a lot of really great research saying that coaches and athletic trainers specifically want more advanced opportunities to learn this. They know there's a mental side. They're not saying that there isn't, but there's no continuing education. It's not necessarily taught in the classes. It's not something that's readily available. But when we ask them if they want it, they say they do. And then it just kind of stops. So we're really great at asking, but not the best at then putting together something that's easily user-friendly. But we know it's beneficial. And we know it's beneficial, this is a really busy model. But it's a really great model, and I think you'll have access to the slides later, and I really encourage you to kind of zoom in and look at the middle part because there's some really great examples, and these are things that I've worked with plenty of athletes. This is happening, and it's happening very dynamically, and it's very specific to the athlete, and I can tell you I've seen that athlete in the morning, and I've seen him in the afternoon, and it's 2 different people walked in. And this really accounts for that. So this is talking about the mental side of injury. What's happening when they're injured? So at the top is that model I showed in the injury prevention. But in the middle is what happens once that injury is sustained. So it's saying that athlete's personal experience. Have they been injured before? Have they successfully rehabbed? Is this their first time ever being injured? Do they have really great social support? Is mom and dad able to get them to physical therapy? And then also their situational factors. I grew up in Iowa, a lot of rural places in Iowa, not really great in weather like this because they don't get plowed out. So those, my friends who lived in the country, they didn't get into school a lot, so they probably weren't getting into rehab. Another big thing here is how it happened, how the athlete perceived it happened. Was that a cheap shot? This wouldn't have happened, but I got tripped. And trust me, that's one that sticks with them. They get real angry. So it's those things happening that then helps the athlete appraise the situation. It will show how they're going to behave in the situation and how they're going to feel about that situation. So as coaches, it's so important that as soon as the injury happens, you're helping them appraise this as a challenge that they can overcome. It's not a barrier, it's a challenge. They have what they have the skills to get over it and get through it. And you are going to help them find the people and the resources to get them through it. Because if we can have them appraise this as something that they can take on, trust me, the rest of the cycle gets a lot better. They're starting to maybe be a little more motivated. They're showing up, they're really putting in the effort. They've teamed up with another teammate who's injured too, and they're coming in every day, they're putting in the work. That's positive behavior that's going to lead to better outcomes. Versus an athlete who's like, I got tripped, this is the worst thing ever, stop talking to me, I don't want to be hurt, but you know what, I'm hurt and I'm not going to show up and I'm angry and please don't talk to me. And it's just like on and on and on and on, and then they're like, I'm not showing up, this is boring. I have to sit here for like 5 minutes and do like quad sets, like seriously, I'm stronger than that and everything. And then you're like, okay, this is not going to end well for anybody. So just really understanding that if we can get them to appraise this as like not the worst thing in the world, we can see some better outcomes. And then I just want to put in a little note at the bottom. There is a thing about referrals. My co-doc student Mackenzie will talk tomorrow more about mental health. She has a counseling background. Mine is very much athletic medicine based. But I will say, as coaches, you're the first line to recognize and refer and to get that athlete help. So please, if you have an athlete who's getting stuck in this, they just can't get over the injury, they're very angry about it, maybe they're not showing up and they were somebody who was always there even if they had been injured before, starting to recognize that and really get them the help. But also noting, referrals don't just mean to mental health resources. It's really great if you have an athlete who's maybe injured, a lot of stress fractures, things like that, bringing in a biomechanist to get a gait analysis going. Maybe there's something a little off with their gait. You are all very capable of doing this as well. You have the knowledge there, so just really, maybe taking that next step and saying like, you know what, I want you to kind of run back and forth and I want to see, and then you realize that they have a leg length discrepancy and you're like, oh, that might be why your back hurts all the time, kind of thing. So just knowing that referrals don't just necessarily mean mental health, it can mean helping them in many other ways. Like I said, I'm an orthotic fitter, so I always say having good shoes, having orthotics in your shoes, making sure that it's the right shoe for the person's foot, that can go a long way. The track and field athletic trainers that I worked with when I was at the U previously, their knowledge on shoe design was just unparalleled. Like the way they manipulated the foot, and they'd be like, oh, you need this shoe with this kind of, just the amount of knowledge that they had on the shoe was just beyond anything. So just making sure that you're utilizing those people who have that knowledge, or if you have that knowledge, you're sharing that, just can go a long way for foot health. But the best thing I can say is if we put the athlete at the center and we work as a team, this is what gets the athlete back successfully. Whether that's to sport or to life, I think they're both important, but if we can get that athlete back to a happy, healthy life, I think we've done our job. So questions on rehab. All right, so I talked about one of the reasons that mental skills tend to be underutilized is we don't do a lot of application and practice. So I'm going to show you, the first one I'm going to show you is what I do a lot with goal setting, and then the other things will be activities for us to do. So I apologize, this is a volleyball example. I've worked a lot of volleyball, so I took this from something that I've used before. But it a lot of times helps to just map out what that rehab process looks like for the athlete. Like I said, I know the physical milestones they're going to hit because that rehab protocol is telling me. So I put it into like a fun pyramid for that athlete, and they can move like their little tracker up and they can check boxes off. There's nothing more like therapeutic than like marking something off. So like giving them a tool, and this goes right on front of their rehab folder, and every day they're like, look, I moved it, or like I got to check a box kind of thing. So a little bit goes a long way, especially when you're in those like long, daunting rehabs where you're like, oh my gosh, like I'm gonna spend the next 9 months with Bridget, yay. this helps. So this is just an example of goal setting. But I want to do an activity with self-talk. I love self-talk. Like I said, a lot of times we don't realize we're saying things to ourselves. So if you have a phone, paper, pencil, we're gonna replicate this for you all. So you're gonna start by just thinking about things you say to yourself. And it doesn't have to be physical activity related. It could just be in life. And just start jotting down some of the things that you say to yourself regularly. Alright, as you continue to write things, like keep going, start, put a square around the statements that are negative and a circle around the ones that are either neutral or positive. And to do this, like with arts and crafts with your team, is a lot of fun. Anytime like I bring in art supplies and it's just like a whole thing happening. That and yoga, two things that they get like really stoked about. So this doesn't have to be like just paper and pencil. You can bring in like markers and everything and color coordinate it and like have a fun team bonding thing. As you can see, it was a little bit more colorful. But so kind of just think through those statements. And then I want you to pick 2 or 3 of them. We never want to do it. You never want an athlete who's like, I want to change all 10 of these, because that's not really feasible. So have them start with like a couple of them, and then as they accomplish those, then you continually move on. So maybe pick one today that you want to kind of reframe. And then I want you to work to reframe it, to rewrite it. Is it something that you want it to be more instructional? So in this example, activate. The athlete was like, yeah, I'm telling myself to activate. I'm like, well, what are you activating? And they're like, well, my stomach. And I'm like, oh, okay. Like, is that really helpful when you're like activate, or do you just kind of do a like type of thing? And they're like, oh yeah, that's probably not super helpful. So working with them, the strength coach would always yell, tuck your butt, strong gut at them. So he used a cue that was already instructional to him, something that he was already familiar with. Instead of saying activate, he was actually cueing himself. So that's a way to use it instructionally. Motivationally, instead of saying like one more, I'm gonna destroy this rep, and putting the emphasis on this rep, being present in the moment with that one. It's not the quantity, it's the quality of this one rep. And then make sure that they're simple. The top one is a little bit longer. I wouldn't go much longer than that, but that they're positive if it's something where you're trying to be motivational. Research has shown your brain actually doesn't hear you say the not. So if you say like, do not do this, it doesn't hear not. So it just hears like, do this. So that's why we try to keep it positive, because science actually is telling us it's not hearing you say don't do it. So just working through to really change those and reframe some of them. And then where I take this next with the athletes, so if it's in a rehab situation, I have them write it on their rehab sheet. I have them write it on their strength and conditioning sheet, on any of their logs. I have them put it somewhere they see it. And when I'm really trying to get them to do it every day, I put check boxes by it, and I'm like, today in the strength and conditioning room, you're gonna say this to yourself 3 times. And after each time you say it, put a mark on there. And then it just becomes natural. The more they do it, the better they are at it. So hopefully this was an exercise that you can take forward, but something that's just fun. And like I said, make it arts and crafts. So we do this with college students and they love it. So next is mindfulness. This is a really great one when you're traveling, especially. So a lot of the times I worked with teams and we were traveling all the time. Every time we woke up, we were in a different place. You'd kind of wake up and be like, okay, what state or time zone or place am I in? It can be kind of daunting, especially during the academic year. So this is really helpful in, just a pregame like warm up. You walk into the gym or you walk into a new stadium and you're like, okay, what are 5 things I can see? And then you just really take that moment to do that. So I'm going to ask you all to work through this today in here. And when you're done, just kind of give me like a thumbs up. But really take your time. And keep in mind, it doesn't have to be like 5 things you can see. If you're like in a restaurant, maybe it's 5 things they can taste, type of thing. Like this is just one example. Dr. Silva is one of my professors who taught us this, and it's something that we do a lot, and it's really great. It really puts you like in the present and like makes you feel like, okay, I know where I'm at now. Especially like the hearing kind of things, like being able to become like comfortable with like a lot of the sounds. Is something athletes say can be very helpful. Like it kind of brings them into the mindset of like, yep, I'm competing today. This isn't practice, I'm competing, type of thing. So breathing, 4, 7, 8 breathing. I love this because you just remember like inhale for 4, hold for 7, exhale for 8. Super easy, very great if you have an athlete who goes down acutely to like get to them to calm them down. As soon as they start counting, they tend not to be thinking about the fact that they're like in a lot of pain. I mean, they may still think they're in pain, and they may still be in pain, but this is another way to, until you can get them to like a safer place and like get them off of the field, to really just have them focus on something other than what's happening with the injury. So I want you all to practice this with me. So I'm gonna count it out. So inhale for 4, 3, 2, 1, hold, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, exhale, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I recommend the first time you do this with an athlete, you actually count for them, because I was going based off the timer on my screen, and a lot of times they're like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and it's like, yeah, that's not really super helpful, and not doing what it's trying to do. So this is actually working on getting out of that fight or flight and into that calming relaxation stage. And then as you go through this with them a couple times, it also helps expand like lung capacity and has like some really great physiological benefits to breathing well. But I just recommend actually like counting for them the first time they do it. And then I won't have you do this one because you have to like touch your nose, and I know like we're still like post-pandemic stuff and like flu season and all that fun stuff, strep. So if you work, it's really fun just in general, but if you also work with like younger athletes, so grade school and everything, this is really fun to do with like kindergarteners. But it's alternate nostril breathing. This is a yoga technique that's used a lot. And I can also tell you, if you have sinus problems, this is like super beneficial sometimes when you're congested. But it's just really working on like, you put your hand kind of in like a Y, and you're plugging one nostril while you're like breathing in, and then you're plugging that one and breathing out the other side. And it's a good thing to take your mind off of things, because you'll find yourself like really focusing on like, which finger am I supposed to use, and like I went out of the wrong nostril. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen Bull Durham, where it's like he's breathing out of the wrong eyelid kind of thing. Like, you're kind of feeling like I was supposed to be in the left nostril, now I have the wrong one plugged, kind of thing. So a lot of fun, and something great, especially if you have like, I don't know, children. I know a lot of people do this with their kids, so just something fun to add in. And I do just want to thank you. So this is really great being here for track and field. It is in my blood. That's my grandpa actually competing. He ran for the Army and at my alma mater, Northern Iowa, and then he was actually my track coach. So that is a picture of my grandpa and I. So this was just really exciting to be here and talk about a sport that has been very near and dear to my family's heart. And I will take questions. I will also be here afterwards if it's not something you want to like yell out, but if you have anything, yeah.
You talk about your staff.